couple of days. So it's been interesting to hear some references to smart legal contracts, things like the Accord project and generating smart contracts, and things around storage of data, these kind of issues that keep popping up. So I'm going to address some of those. So we're going to look through some practical use cases. So the theme of this section is around real-world adoption. So we'll be looking at some real-world projects that have happened, that are about to happen in the future, or existing projects that are about to become DLT enabled. And the theme around this, linking it all, is smart legal contracts, and in particular around ESG, and how do we contract for ESG, considering it's so important these days in the construction industry and other industries as well. So we'll be looking at some of the use cases. The weather ledger was mentioned yesterday, so but I'll go into a little bit more depth on that. Some of you are quite familiar with it anyway. It's been around for a number of years, and we're hoping to launch that again over the next few months. So we'll be mostly focused in around ESG, and just a little bit at the end around some of the things that we're doing using natural language processing for helping to generate smart legal contracts, which might be of interest to some of you. So a little bit about myself. I think I've probably met everybody almost at this. You know, I wear many different hats. So I've been with CBC, I guess, for last number of years. Some of you, I think it's the first one I've presented at in person, but a lot of online, so it's nice to meet everybody. So I'm part of UCL Centre for Blockchain Technologies. I teach in the UCL School of Management and also in computer science as well. But outside of that, I'm also involved quite a lot in entrepreneurial activities, mostly in the Web3 space, ideally the overlap between Web3 and natural language processing and machine learning in general. I'm part of a few different blockchain organizations and open source projects, one of which is the DSF, the DLT Science Foundation. So if anybody's interested in getting grants for some work that you might be doing, I look more after their educational programs, but there's opportunities for collaboration there. And I'm part of the Accord project, which was mentioned a few times over the last few days, which is a smart legal contract open source organization. And I'm also part of the technical steering committee for the Hedera Hashgraph DLT approach. It's not a blockchain, it's a DLT, subtle difference, which has also been mentioned a few times as well. And then I've mentored at various different academies and incubators, accelerator programs, and previously worked at a law firm as well. So I understand a lot on the legal aspects. I am not a lawyer, so direct any legal questions down to that man down at the back around this, who will no doubt sort of point out some flaws in my work here. But it was active in the smart legal contract and DLT space, so I understand a little bit about that area. And I'm currently working in a venture builder, helping to build Web3 startups in a number of different areas. And one of the areas that we're focused on is around smart legal contracts in regulation and also the view towards construction as well. So lots going on. So starting with smart legal contracts, thankfully, I'd say for one group that I've spoken to who actually understand this space, because it comes up quite often, it's kind of interesting to see the mentions of smart legal contracts come up so frequently over the last few days. Many other industries that I speak to, even within the legal profession, are not overly aware of this area. So it's an exciting development. Obviously, there's differences between smart contracts and smart legal contracts. A smart contract could be considered a smart legal contract in England and Wales if it fulfills a number of different criteria. And the legal status of these is improving across different jurisdictions. But there is a logical difference between the two, and there's lots of different forms they can exist in, and this was mentioned in a number of talks over the last couple of years, and also over the last couple of days with hybrid forms, etc. When I work with smart legal contracts, I tend to think of them as hybrid contracts, where you have the natural language agreement, and then you have some sort of code implementation. Now, the thing with smart legal contracts is they don't necessarily need to exist on a distributed ledger technology. They can exist in just standalone code. They can execute in Lambda functions, for example, in an AWS environment, or Azure functions if you're in Azure, or just standalone implementations. But they do work better when in some sort of DLT environment, either in a public permission blockchain or ideally on something like a public blockchain. And that's not to say that the code of the smart contract runs on-chain, but we can run some proofs off-chain with some on-chain data and put proof of execution back on-chain. So we don't necessarily need to store the contract on-chain. For many different commercial reasons, you wouldn't want to do that. You wouldn't want to necessarily reveal the terms and conditions that people have signed up for, etc. So there's lots of different ways. It's a very flexible system, and I'll talk a little bit more about the architecture around that. But I guess the key thing from a legal perspective is we're starting to see these things be enforceable. Not very well tested, they are in certain domains, but we're certainly seeing some advances in this space and also around regulation for digital assets as well. One of the things that has also recently happened in the UK, at least, is around some of the use cases that were mentioned yesterday, but I forget the speaker's name, but the first session yesterday from the Fraunhofer Institute around tracking documents with shipments. Well, in the UK at the moment, the digital bills of lading and other electronic trade documents are now legally recognised, which is actually a great step forward. And I was involved in some of the proofs of concept in this area, representing a bill of lading, which is a shipping document, for those of you who don't know, as an NFT using Hedera. We did some work in the past with the land registry as well on trying to improve their conveyancing process. So we're starting to see these traditional, slow, paper-based systems finally move to electronic versions and then eventually into some on-chain version of this. But progress is slow, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. So other industries like construction generally are quite slow to move. I had a construction startup probably about 12 years ago, so I know this space, and not much has changed from the pace of development, I would say. But nevertheless, we're starting to see some positive moves in that direction. So from the Accord project perspective, which is the one that came up a few times, I think there were 4 mentions of different smart legal contract frameworks mentioned yesterday. Actually, there's quite a few more than that, and the Weather Ledger actually just really used the Accord project under the hood. But I guess one of the leading ones that's out there is probably DAML and the Accord project. So the idea for this is to be agnostic. It's a separation of the templates and the data models and the contract logic. So in the past, the contract logic was written in a domain-specific language, but now actually we've opened that up into other ways of representing the contract logic. So people can get involved at different layers, and there's a lot of discussion yesterday that was quite interesting around the relationship between a lawyer and a programmer. Do you need to be both a lawyer and a programmer to do these things? Well, it can work quite collaboratively. You can have the lawyer working with the programmer and agreeing, is this the right interpretation of this clause? It's not an easy space. We had some very good discussions about this over the last few days. It's hard to get right, even when everybody's on the same page. So it's a tricky process, but nevertheless, for certain clauses, and I'm not saying we can automate all clauses in the 400-page document that you're referring to yesterday in a construction contract, that would be ambitious and probably foolish at this point. But nevertheless, there is scope for some happy path, some automation, some benefits for things that are well-defined, standardized, and can add some transactional value. So it's trying to be realistic about what's possible and what's feasible. But the more reuse we have and the more standard clauses, which is something that lawyers don't always want, but it can start to improve efficiencies across the industry. And again, when you push that together with distributed ledger technologies and oracles, so different types of data sources, I did a presentation about 2 years ago, I think, on different types of oracles that are out there, and the space has moved on quite a bit. I was at a conference in Paris about 4 weeks ago, I think, at the end of ETHCC. They had a dedicated 2-day event for oracles, and it's really interesting what's going on in the space. In particular, using machine learning and natural language processing and large language models to help with extraction of data and autonomous agents that work in this space as well. So the whole ecosystem is sort of like a building block of smart legal contracts, DLT, oracles, data sources, and external systems. So we try to look at what are modular approaches to building solutions. So some of the things that we're up to in this space regarding construction is around simple things around payments. So payments came up quite a lot over the last few days. Looking at, can we improve standard clauses using the Accord project for either finishing a piece of work, either in sections or as a complete piece of work. It's a relatively straightforward place to start. But I have a few different versions of this, and I'm keen for collaboration if anybody's willing to work with me on this to start to put some of these standard clauses in place. So this is a UK example. I can't remember if it's JCT or NEC looking at it, but if we can have some sort of approach towards building standard versions of these clauses, that would be very helpful for the industry. Another one that I was working on was to do with a project that Abel was mentioning yesterday around the steel beams. And in particular, that project was looking at putting fiber optic cables inside the steel beam to see if they moved over time. If you take it out 50, 100 years in the future, you need to see if the material has been damaged, and using different types of sensors and LiDAR and various other things to try and guess the state of it. But it turns these from being sort of a CapEx into an OpEx. You rent the steel rather than buying the steel. So it's a very interesting use case that we're working on in the past with Arup. But one that's come up in the past is the weather ledger, which was mentioned quite a few times yesterday, actually. So this was one of the first examples of a parametric, well, it's now moving more towards a parametric insurance product. So the idea was it was trying to make one of the existing clauses in the NEC, which is again one of those UK construction contracts around weather, to be far more accurate. So was there a 10-year storm? And then how do you define a 10-year storm? And was it actually right where that building site was? So it was trying to improve accuracy in that space using all kinds of sensors. So a combination of software, so IBM weather data, for example, and devices physically deployed on those sites with all of the issues that come with deploying hardware on building sites. So things like power issues and people plugging devices out to charge their phone, and connectivity issues, etc. So it was challenging. But the idea was trying to gather as many different sources as possible and trying to reason with the data that was there to determine whether it was fit to work or not. So for example, in the case that it's a crane, you can't operate a crane, obviously, if it's above a certain level of wind, it's just not safe to do that. So obviously there's knock-on effects. If you can't work, there's delays to the project, and how is that resolved ultimately? So at least this gathers some ground truth. And then ultimately this turns into a parametric insurance product. So ultimately gather all the data, trust the oracles. So the data was gathered off chain, but needs to be verified on chain via a variety of different sources. And then finally reason with that data and make a distinction based on the contract as to whether a compensation event needs to happen or whatever needs to happen as defined in the contract after that. So the whole point is here, it's not two people arguing and looking up weather data, it's data driven, and the data determines the course of action. So this slide here is actually a broader one from not just the weather ledger, but a general approach towards smart legal contracts and oracles. It's based off the Law Tech UK report, which I contributed to a few years ago, around looking at smart legal contracts as a topic. So again, I have quite a few slides which will be available afterwards. So I'm not going to go through everything on this, so don't worry. I see people with cameras and I do the same thing, but you'll get the slides. But here's an example of that clause. Let's skip straight to that, which is a little hard to read up there, but you can see that there are parameters defined in the clause, and they will come from those IoT devices. They will get normalized and verified. We want maybe 2 sensors, 3 sensors, 5 sensors, so it's not just one sensor giving that particular input, and then that's normalized over time as well. So the idea is your contract clause is smart, and then they can determine if this was a freak weather event, if it is a 1 in 10 storm, which did happen during that run of the project. So the whole process for what happens around compensation is defined here. There's a whole report that I've linked to in here, and you don't need to read it off here, but this was in collaboration with a company called eHab, who myself and Abel know quite well, the team there. And we're looking at trying to rerun this project now within HS2, which is a large infrastructure project in the UK, probably the largest, I'm guessing. It's a large rail project that's happening. So the HS2 are interested not just in the weather ledger, but in smart legal contracts in general, and what other cost savings could be involved from using them. Yeah, here's just another example of what that looks like. So yeah, I guess that's a project that we're quite interested in pursuing. I would have hoped I could have said more at this point, but still waiting on a final decision from HS2 over hopefully the next couple of weeks, but they do seem quite committed to it. I had a workshop with them with an organization called the Digital Catapult in the UK around ESG and also around smart legal contracts, and they're very keen on this space and ensuring that things are more accurate, reducing disputes by making these things data-driven where practical. It doesn't always work in all cases, but they want to take some baby steps in this space. Wasn't going to be the topic of my talk at all, because this was covered yesterday very well about DAOs, but Unfortunately, I couldn't attend the later session, the Arch DAO. That looked really interesting, but it's an area I do work in. We're building a DAO for one of the ventures that we're working with, not in the construction, in a very different space. But it's a very interesting concept, I think, and the whole legal wrapper around DAOs and the jurisdictional issues that were all discussed yesterday. I think it's a fascinating area, and one that requires quite a lot of attention, I think, at this point. A lot of companies are starting to look towards this model. And smart legal contracts can play a role here, which is why it's up here as well. Is can you have governance governed by legal agreements that are adaptive based off, for example, the vote in a DAO, so that you have participator agreements, etc., which are data driven from on-chain or off-chain. Not all DAO voting is on-chain for various reasons that we can go into over coffee or whatever. But I think there's a role for using smart legal contracts in that space as well. So what I'm really here to talk about is contracting for ESG. So at the moment, so first of all, ESG, I presume most people in the room know this, not every domain does, but around the environmental, social and governance aspects. So we're looking at, in particular, environmental for the topic of these examples that I'm looking at. Again, sensor-driven ideally, and also based off a number of different factors and a number of different data sources that are available for companies. So the idea is that in many cases, ESG has obviously been something many companies are very passionate about. It's also has a bad reputation in some cases for greenwashing, where companies say they're doing great things, but in reality they're not, and nobody's really holding them to account. It's good marketing, but now things have moved away from ESG just being something that people want to say, yes, we're being green, and now it's moving more into there are real cost savings and there are compliance issues. So particularly in the construction sector, again in the UK, things are moving more towards having to do ESG rather than a nice to have. And I think the stick is generally a better motivator than a carrot for some of these industries, it's fair to say. So having to do this now, companies have to take a far greater consideration of what their supply chain looks like and what does ESG look like in their supply chain. And we've heard a bit about this from talks over the last few days as well. So bigger companies will go get maybe B Corp certified and go through that process. But the supply chain gets smaller and smaller potentially as you go down. It could be small companies that don't have the resources to get B Corp certified because it costs quite a bit of money to do that. Or they can't accurately check their supply chain themselves and understand their ESG commitments. So things are moving a bit in that space, and I'll give you examples of some registries and other companies that are trying to help in this space. But what we're trying to do is to help construction companies to ensure compliance and accountability as well. So ensuring that they are compliant by ensuring that everybody downstream from them in their supply chain is compliant. And how do we do that? Well, there are different systems, and you're constantly checking registries and taking people at their word for a little while, but you're not necessarily checking to see if they've really hit their obligations. And then you might have a contract which says, well, we have our ESG commitments and we need you to hit your ESG commitments, but there's a major disconnect between what actually happens and what's written in the contract. So what we've been trying to build is a set of contractual tools and smart legal contracts in this case, for checking to see, can we define standard ESG clauses? There are some out there, we've implemented those. Might need a lawyer to check that I've implemented them correctly, but at least it's a starting point. And then I've gone ahead and started to look at, well, what could we do if these clauses were a little bit more clever and based off the underlying data sources that we have available. So I've been trying to put together a set of reusable clauses that can be used for contracting in your supply chain. And then obviously that's not always perfect. We heard a lot about disputes yesterday. So one large advantage of all of this is, at least if you're gathering the data, smart contracts or smart legal contracts are not always perfect, but at least if you can gather the underlying data and either it's stored on-chain or more than likely off-chain with references, you're building an audit trail for disputes. And then the result of that dispute could potentially be computed in a number of different ways, most likely off-chain at the moment, but there are more online dispute resolution solutions that are coming their way, which is another thing we're working on. But there's a lot of advantages and disadvantages for this space, it's fair to say. So in particular, this this way of going right down to the bottom of the supply chain. How do we do this, and understanding the chain that's there. So you would have to contract one party, they would then have to make the same sort of contract with their subcontractors, etc. But we're trying to make that easier if there's standard clauses. And one problem downstream might be able to be rectified before it gets too far up into the supply chain. Therefore, there's massive cost savings for everybody. So that's the general idea, is to try to keep people honest. Breaches happen, but it's about determining the breaches as early as possible and trying to rectify them. And the more visibility people have of this, the more likely they are that they'll stop getting into these situations where they have to pay fines or they have to lose out in some regard, because it's really not been tracked particularly well. So what we're doing is inserting sustainability clauses into the supply chain contracts. And in certain cases, that's mandated already, and we're just enforcing that. In others, we're getting them to think about it right from the beginning, even if it's not mandated. So getting ahead of the curve and making sure, if you're thinking about new contracts, that you start to put these contracts in before even the regulator is requiring you to do so. And then you can start to effect some change in your supply chain before the regulators come in too heavy. And that's the idea, really, is trying to look at, can we track this? Can we verify what people are doing? And then if there is a breach, what happens in that point? So things that happen in remediation are, let's say, for example, you might deduct some of the payment from a supplier. So it's just, okay, we're going to give you 20% less, or it might be proportional to the nature of the breach, or maybe the number of times that you've had a breach. It might be, okay, first time we'll let you away with it, but it could be third time, sorry, you're going to lose 20-30% of the agreed fee. Beyond that, it could be donating to a climate charity. So it could be nominating a particular charity in relation to the nature of the breach. So carbon is the easiest one to work with, in the sense that it's easy enough to buy carbon credits, but it isn't for good quality carbon credits, which we'll be talking about in a little while. Or it could be a combination of all of these. It might start out with a small little, okay, buy some offsets, and then it might lead into other aspects that are more drastic after that. So you have these logic components that you can start to build reasonable, flexible clauses depending on the nature of the breach. So starting from this particular project called the Chancery Lane project, this has defined some standard construction ESG related breaches, mostly in the carbon space. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. So this is what I started out with, is trying to make a version of this that adapts based on the emissions for a particular project. So here's a clause from that. So you can kind of guess here that if you breach your total emissions in a period, so the period could be a month, a year, 6 months, whatever it is, by more than, for example, in this case, 0.5%, then the amount that you'll be paid will be reduced by 0.1% per ton of CO2 above your agreed limit. And that can start to ramp up pretty quickly. So you can start to see, if you go over in your emissions, then pretty quickly you're going to get less money in your pocket very, very quickly. So these are standard clauses. Again, I didn't start with this one, I just implemented it. But they're already in these types of contracts, but it requires somebody with a calculator or an Excel spreadsheet to go and check these things and figure out what the amount of deduction is. So it's a time-consuming process, and it's not always very accurate. So if we can start to have standard clauses around this, it becomes an awful lot easier. Where possible, we try to use IoT sensors so that things are as accurate as possible. Like in the weather ledger, it's a combination of software and hardware. The hardware is not always practical, but things are changing there with better connectivity and devices that have much longer battery life and are rugged, like that puck we saw yesterday. But we're starting to sort of build out that pipeline, so data ingestion, processing of data, and then we've got the smart contractual clauses that start to trigger these events, reduce payments, make hold payments in escrow, for example, and then split. When a payment is due, maybe after 6 months, we check, okay, what was your real ESG value versus your one that's in the contract? Okay, there's a breach, well, we'll pay you 80% and 20% goes to a carbon charity, for example, or a climate charity. So that's the example that I implemented in the past on the Hedera blockchain. And all this is tracked. People can get notifications, emails, so it's all very transparent. You could inject a human into the loop if for whatever reason you didn't want that to happen automatically. You could be nominated and they might just need to press OK, and let this go ahead as per the contract, but there could have been some force majeure or some sort of event that might have happened. As we said, realistically, these things are not always as trivial as they might sound. So one of the sources of ESG that we're using and trying to do this as accurately as possible is a thing called the Guardian. And this was a quote from some of the team in Hedera who were trying to build carbon registries. So Hedera itself is quite environmentally sustainable. In fact, it is. We did a project at the UCL CBT on analyzing the carbon footprint for many different DLTs, and Hedera is very, very efficient, cheap and fast. So it makes sense to try and build something that's trying to be environmentally sustainable on a ledger like this. So the team are quite committed to it. And so they've been building an open source tool called the Guardian. And the idea here is around verification mechanisms for different types of carbon tracking or cook stoves, reforestation, preservation of natural capital assets like peat bogs in the northern part of the UK. So it's looking at these different methodologies. Some of the methodologies are really flawed. They're kind of ridiculed at this stage, more or less in public. They were a good starting point at the time, but there was a lot of double counting and not being handled very well. So it gives the possibility of making better versions of these things and deploying them and ensuring the tokens get minted with the entire audit trail of where that carbon, let's say in this case, or carbon reduction or carbon capture happened. So it's a very interesting project. It's open source. There is a hosted service as well that you can use. And the idea is to try and make ESG reporting more credible. So that deals with the methodologies and the origin of these carbon capture projects or carbon reduction projects. But then that's surfaced via many different players in the ecosystem. So it's got a whole set of marketplaces built on top of that. And so you can find this all on the Hedera website. This is probably not even a full list, but ones like Dovu were out of the box early. So they take the carbon credits, which are verified through that, and then they provide a liquid carbon marketplace. So you can integrate this in with a smart legal contract. So if somebody's found to be in a breach, then the contract can automatically deduct some of the payments and buy some Dovu tokens, for example. So therefore you have this immediate cause and effect. You breach the agreement, your ESG commitments didn't match your obligations. Now it's going to automatically buy these carbon credits for you. And you can, there's lots of different options that are out there. So, buy it at a reasonable price, etc. But yeah, there's a whole ecosystem that has been built up around the Guardian. It's a workflow engine, so you can define these different methodologies. It's a bit like Scratch, if anybody's used Scratch or seen Scratch. Is a very useful programming environment for teaching children mostly to learn how to code. It's actually quite flexible. We're using it for more than just this. We're actually using it for building general purpose workflows. It resembles a little bit the BPML tool that was yesterday. I used to use that stuff years ago, but same kind of idea. Can you build workflows and plug in different web services, etc.? And there's a little bit about the architecture, which we won't go into. I'm leaving these slides in if people are more interested in it, because it's not the topic, so we can get it afterwards. But there's a lot of workflows in there for capturing both from humans and validators and verifiers. So the audit trail it's there, but also for IoT devices as well. So there's an example of using cook stoves, which have embedded IoT sensors, which will capture the temperature, how long the stove ran for, and that would give you an idea of how much carbon was captured. So it's actually quite a good toolkit for building ESG related workflows. So all of that sort of leads into building an ESG scorecard. So using some of those suppliers that are on the next few slides gives you a score that's in an E, an S, and a G, basically. And then you can start to reason based off, well, my commitment will be, I want to score 80, for example, in my E, and maybe something lower in the S, and something higher again in the G, and that can shift over time, and you can start to reason with, well, do you do an aggregate score over all three, or do you just weight one a little bit higher? Either way, it depends on what's important for you as a company. It's giving you the tools to go and define how you want to build these things. And different companies will want to do it different ways. So one of the registries that we find exciting at the moment, it's early days for it, but it's the team from OpenESG. who are based sort of between London and Singapore. Hopefully see them next week. I'm going over to Singapore for Token 2049, and we're going to nail this out a bit more. But it's a DAO that's trying to produce more accurate ESG scoring for small companies in particular. So it's a very interesting team. They were involved in Consensus back when they started, and one of the founders built ENS, the Ethereum name service, and they're using a lot of machine learning in the background as well, so sort of an ESG chatbot, so that you can ask questions and it can start to help you to generate your own ESG score, and then it can be verified afterwards. So again, it gives you this 3 scores, the E, the S, and the G rating. You can stick that on your website so that when somebody visits it, then you can start to see what that looks like. Okay, so there are many other suppliers. There's Carbonbase, Refinitiv, Provenance. There's a number of these solutions. So we're trying to aggregate multiple sources into an Oracle solution and then determine based off those scores what the final score would be. And when you pull all that together, you get something that looks a bit like this. You've got data sources on the left-hand side, oracles and data capture and storing those raw results. There's a lot of talk of IPFS. We actually use Filecoin. Filecoin is a layer above IPFS, but it's actually got quite a number of interesting features, including its own virtual machine. And I did ask one of the Filecoin members a question yesterday from Protocol Labs. I used to work with them at UCL, and they were working, as far as I'm aware, on a way of doing geographic specific storage. So this question comes up quite a lot about storing of data. Let's say, for example, in China, it needs to stay in China. In the EU, it needs to stay in the EU, likewise for the US. But even though it's a decentralized system, they are looking at ways of doing it so that it's just distributed between nodes in those jurisdictions. So that's worthwhile checking out for some of you to see how that's getting on. I haven't got an answer back. But we gather the data, we oracleize it, we use some NLP for extraction, run that through the smart legal contract examples that you saw, and then finally check to see what the commitments were, and then take those remedial actions if necessary, or gather data for disputes. That's what it kind of looks like when you pull it all together. That's an example of the clause. This is the sort of front end that we use internally, the building blocks for building our smart legal contracts. Again, it's built on top of a lot of open source components from the Accord project. But yeah, we have these, that's what the contract would look like. It could be verified, unverified, maybe set a threshold amount. Just gives you a little bit of flexibility in how you put these things together. And again, it's all built using Accord project, so it's standard JSON representation for a schema that people can contribute to, and it's quite flexible. What it looks like when we pull the whole lot together, just in the interest of time, I'm sort of almost out here, but you write the contract, define the models, then define the template first, and then the companies will put in the specific values per supplier, and then that gets deployed on chain, and then finally we monitor the registries, and then we check every so often to see, well, what was the commitments. Maybe it's every month, every 6 months. It depends on the frequency of updates for these things and how frequently you need to pay out. And then finally, you can start to interact with Hedera. In this case was the example we looked at, but in reality, this will work with any other chain, anything that's EVM compatible, or it doesn't require a huge amount of tweaking to get it to work with other chains. So the idea here is we just move tokens out of escrow and pay sort of a wallet that would be for a climate charity or for the supplier. And all of those wallets are defined in the contract itself. So just like you put a bank account in. We're doing some work in pollution, just in the area of time. I won't go into that, but we're working with a company called MSOL. I spoke about this last year, so anybody who was here at not the research one, the other one last year, we defined some of these use cases, but they're tracking pollution, so air pollution, noise pollution, and they use cameras to try and identify who was the cause of that pollution. So it could be dust, it could be noise, a leaf blower, for example, smoking, or whatever it is. On different building sites, and there are live deployments of this on HS2 sites and at some hospitals in the UK as well. So same kind of thing, we're looking at tracking noise pollution and other types of pollution events in the same types of contract. And they look for levels, and does it go over the WHO level, and other recommendations, or local guidance on noise pollution, for example. So that's a similar sort of approach, similar kind of architecture. And then just the last little thing is not one to go into now. We spoke a bit about it last year, but just to indicate anybody who's interested in using NLP and large language models to try to generate smart legal contracts or smart contracts, as was discussed a little bit yesterday. That's an area that we're working on as well. We've got a research project within the Accord project around this entire area. We have some sort of proofs of concept that are out there. This is a paper we wrote that we presented in the US last year, and that was using sort of BERT and other traditional models, but now we're starting to use more of the fancier LLMs that are out there. And we're also working with Adobe, who have a research paper in the space of generating obligation logic graphs from smart legal contracts as well. So they have a paper out in this space as well. So just to mention that that's an area that we're looking at. That work goes on inside the Accord project in a subgroup that I lead called the Accord Project NLP Working Group. And if you want to join, that's the Discord link. Probably hard to get it on there. I meant to do the QR code, but I timed out this morning, but I can happily show you the proper link afterwards. And I think that was my last slide because Abel gave me the 5-minute warning about 5 minutes ago, even though I think I still have another 5 minutes. But that's it. I can finish on time. That's just our team, and thank you. If you want to reach out either on the UCL hat or the Building Blocks hat or DSF hat has a different email address, but you get the idea. But thanks very much.